Ready? That's fine.
Okay. Got the stool. Good job. All right, let's see. So, good morning. Today we are here to present our budget, the 2021 budget to council and to the public. And these are usually really big deals in our city. There's usually pageantry and events and guest speakers and so forth. So obviously during these tough times, it doesn't look like that. This is much more about nuts and bolts and about how we're weathering the storm. Now, we are going to go through all the details as we always would, and we have lots of different folks who are going to chime in on that. But I also want to let folks know that I'm grateful that we are able to put together a balanced budget, and one that doesn't have a bunch of draconian things in it, and one that reflects, I think, our city's values. That is something very, very few mayors can actually say right now in America. So I do believe that as tough as times are, I'm grateful to live in Albuquerque. I'm proud to live in Albuquerque. And I really appreciate the fact that our city, at least on a relative basis, is just demonstrating leadership each and every day, and in this budget in every way during the pandemic. So here is our budget that is going to be discussed through the next 2 months through the council process. And this, of course, is a little bit off timing from what it normally would be because of the pandemic, but we're on target to hopefully get this done with council by the end of October. So we'll be all set up for the next year. And so we appreciate their flexibility and also them working with us, of course, in putting together this initial budget. Now, let me share a couple of things. First, this budget is put together by a huge team. A team that's right outside that door from our finance office, our Department of Finance and Administration. And so I want to thank everyone in that team. Some of them are here with us today. And of course, also the leadership of that team, our director, Renee Martinez, and our CFO, Sanjay Bhakta. And fundamentally, our CAO, Sarita Nair, as well as, of course, our COO, Lawrence Rael, and our budget officer. And I think this is his first budget, actually. So, Lawrence Davis, congratulations on your first budget. This putting together a budget in any time does actually take a long time. And even to sort of print, get in the system, et cetera, I mean, it takes many days to actually get this thing printed out and put together to council just physically. That's after you've done all the math. And so I do just want to acknowledge the hard work of all the staff, both at a senior and junior level, for helping us make that happen. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about it, and then we're going to bring up some folks to walk us through the budget and also go through some of the details. And I'm going to set this here so I have a little bit more room. And so let's talk about a couple aspects of this going into the budget. I think first and foremost, this budget really tackles ongoing challenges during a health crisis. That's what this budget does. It doesn't do a whole lot else because these are tough times. And we're going to explain exactly what we're able to do and what we're not able to do. But we know that this budget during a public health crisis also means that we have to deal with issues that don't wait for the pandemic. In fact, in many ways, they get worse. And I'm talking about crime, addiction, homelessness. We have to keep fighting those no matter what. And this budget does propose investments in public safety, in COVID-19 resilience, and in stepping up for small businesses and working families. And we know COVID-19 has forced cities nationwide and here in New Mexico to enact steep budget cuts and to do employee furloughs and layoffs. Today, we're announcing a budget proposal that navigates through Albuquerque's COVID-19 challenges and prepares us for some tough times ahead. This budget essentially stabilizes city finances and does provide backstops for suffering local businesses, for workers during tough times. And it also demonstrates a deep commitment to investing in core crime fighting and policing alongside our innovative new community safety department. Now, I think back where we were in March. And in March, that is essentially the normal time when we would really be diving deep into the budget and sending it down to council in the following month. And for us in March, we were in a really strong position. We had mapped out new crime initiatives. They weren't started yet, but they were mapped out. And we had officers in the pipeline. They weren't on the streets yet, but we had our batch of 200 in the academy. But I think most importantly back in March, we were also in a very strong economic position. We had seen the highest rates of growth in our economy in many years, in at least half a decade. And we saw it across basically all sectors and all walks of life. Albuquerque was on the cusp of an economic boom. And of course, all of a sudden that whole rug was pulled out from under us and the crisis hit. And we had to take a real strong look, all of a sudden, just 2 weeks later, at what we're going to do with respect to the fact that the entire world changed in April. And I have to say, within weeks, we made a couple of decisions. The first was that we're going to accept the situation as it is. We're not going to point fingers. We're not going to play victim to circumstances. And we're going to take a proactive approach to really deciding how we're going to step up and deal with our issues no matter what comes Albuquerque's way. And that is just what we've been doing, and that is just what this budget is about. So back in April, we started, again, just about 2 weeks after the pandemic, and we worked round the clock to take strong cost-cutting measures. We also set up a process for hunkering down for the long term, doing month-by-month budgets until we could actually get a forecast that we believe was reliable, at least in times of uncertainty. And so we also decided to drastically increase our construction projects, over $100 million of projects to invest in our city while people weren't working and while the streets weren't busy, and I think most importantly to create hundreds of jobs, especially for working families right when they needed it most. And now we're seeing that investment actually come back to us in the form of stronger GRT than expected, and seeing a healthy construction industry even during these times. And so that investment is now something we're able to sort of recoup some of the benefits from in this budget. So while we know that times are still going to be really tough for our city, we are one of the most prepared cities in the nation to weather the corona storm. And I'll cite again that New York Times article that lists multiple cities. I think we're going to show a graph on it, and only Boston is better prepared than we are, and that's actually a wonderful compliment to everything that makes our city a unique and special place. But this is in the context of a storm, so times are tough, and just because we're doing better than other cities doesn't mean we're not hurting and we're not suffering. That is certainly the case here. So for us, we've demonstrated strong and thoughtful leadership during some real difficult times. And we're not going to get knocked off course when it comes to our core values and our core priorities. So we're going to continue to lift up small businesses and working families and our youth. And we're going to make Albuquerque safer. And we're going to continue to look out for the most vulnerable. All of those initiatives are inside this budget. So fundamentally, there are three truths really underneath this budget. And the first one is that there just isn't enough money for any systematic raises. So it's just not in the cards financially. It also means that we can't hire hundreds of new employees and fill vacancies across all departments like we had planned. It's just not going to happen with the amount of money that we have. It also means about $50 million in awesome new ideas and initiatives and fun things we were going to do all over the city. They're just going to have to wait. But it's worth it. Because of this, because of the cuts that we're going to share with you today, we are fortunately able to not have to do broad layoffs or furloughs at this time. And I'm very grateful for that in our city because that has detrimental impacts on city services and, of course, on those families and the businesses in which they frequent. So us not having to do furloughs and layoffs in and of itself, I think, is a real victory and also is helpful to our economy and, of course, most importantly, helpful to all of those working families. As a reminder, I know often because I'm the one who speaks in front of the cameras and so forth, our city has about 6,000 employees. And by far and away, 99% of those employees are working families. They're folks who do hourly work day in and day out to make our city the best city that they can. And those folks in no way are going to have their benefits or their wages cut. And so far, again, not have to have furloughs, and that's extremely important and meaningful for them. Now, this pandemic also has provided a second truth really inside this budget, and it's shown that there are widening cracks in our system that have left working families, single parents, low-income neighborhoods, communities of color, in the broader social safety net completely vulnerable, much more so than it even was before. Our city is keenly focused on doing all we can to fill those cracks and to keep the safety net in place and effective. And the third piece inside this budget is really that we can't let this crisis deter us from investing in fighting violent crime from all sides in our city. And this budget shows a deep commitment to continuing to build frontline community police officers and commitment to that 100 new officers that we've got to get each year. But it also establishes the nation's first cabinet-level community safety department to bring a public health approach to how we keep people safe in the city of Albuquerque. Now, let me touch on a few of these areas in a little bit more detail. First, I want to remind folks that for us, we do believe our construction efforts have been extremely helpful to lift up the economy and those working families, and it's given us additional GRT. So we're going to continue to do that. So as a preview down the road, probably in the end of the month or October, we're going to be talking about the next wave of economic stimulus through infrastructure development. But beyond what I just said, we're not going to go into that today. So stay tuned for more on that in the future. And again, that has to do with one-time expenditures. Today is about our reoccurring budget, which is, in general, not associated with infrastructure. So for us, let's look at our first graphic here. And this is one I know that has been cited a little bit, but I think it's something that's just really important to show. And it basically says that, again, in this context, we know that all of America is suffering, and we know that cities are suffering. At the end of the day, cities are where literally the sort of rubber meets the road between our individual needs, whether it's where we can shop, whether it's where we work, or it's where we live, where we socialize. All of that happens in our cities. And so for us, cities are at the forefront in any crisis. The crisis is borne out from a cost basis and from an individual basis at the city level first. So we see all of these cities in very, very difficult, dire straits, in fact. And again, this is from a New York Times article. You can see different citations here. And, you know, Albuquerque's always been at the bottom of a lot of lists that I don't want to see us on. This is very different because it's in reverse order. So the cities that are doing the best are down here. And you can see that we are in a better financial position than Austin, than Denver, than Dallas, than Houston, than El Paso, than Phoenix, than all of these cities historically that we've held up as role models. Now they are looking at us. So again, with that minor exception of Boston, we are in much, much better shape than a lot of other cities. Now, part of that is because of what we did with respect to cost cutting early and contingencies in terms of how we have dealt with the CARES money and how we have tried to actually budget in a very different way where we include contingency embedded in our rollover budget each year. So as we go to this next slide, I want to highlight just a couple of things that we've done. In total, we've done cost-cutting measures that have almost approached $50 million in the last year, or for this budget year. And this is done in the context with trying to maintain some long-term fiscal health in our budget. So we have flat salaries across the board. We do have a one-time payment to cover health insurance costs so that, again, our frontline workers aren't hit with that additional increase in health costs. We also basically are saving about $15 million in terms of our broad hiring freeze and hiring slowdowns across multiple departments. We've also saved about $500,000 by just cutting things like travel and so forth and training and conferences and all of that kind of thing. I think the biggest chunk in here, too, is really about what we have said no to. We typically add in every year all sorts of new initiatives and department requests for additional funding. And basically, we've said almost $30 million of that we just can't do. And that's something that is very unfortunate, but it's just what we have to do during these times. We've also delayed a couple of $1 million in operating costs for projects that we wanted to sort of start that had already had the infrastructure associated with it. This is what's known as CIP coming online, and we're just not going to be able to do that at this time. Now, I also want to mention to folks, we have adjusted all sorts of service schedules because now we are understaffed citywide. So we're, again, committed to continuing basic things like trash pickup, parks and recs, et cetera. but things might, again, take a couple of days longer than they used to, and so forth. But we're going to get the job done. It's just not going to be quite as fast or as on time as it used to be. So the bottom line is that our 2021 budget really invests in Albuquerque during uncertain times of a pandemic. But we're going to demonstrate that we can continue to improve public safety, we're going to continue to help families, and we're going to continue to support local businesses. And overall, we're going to walk you through the specific numbers, but as a reminder, our general fund budget is actually down from last year. So we're down, I think it's roughly about 8% from last year. Now, it's supplemented by the CARES funding, and so we're going to walk through that. But that is one net effect. Our overall budget with CARES funding still is around $1 billion, and we're going to go over that. I also want to remind folks that because we are such a large city in a rural state, a $1 billion budget actually impacts the entire state of New Mexico. And so this is everything inside this budget actually affects certainly the Albuquerque metro area, but in many ways the rest of the state as well. So with that, let's get into some of the details on this, and I'll come back at the end. And let's begin with our CAO, Sarita Nair, to go over the sort of overview of the specific numbers. Sarita?
All right, hello everybody. Thanks for coming out today. I'm Sarita Nair, the Chief Administrative Officer. The proposed budget for this year is $1.15 billion with $592.3 million in the general fund. And in addition to that, we are proposing the allocation of the remaining about $103 million in CARES Act funding. I want to start by echoing the Mayor's thanks to our budget staff. Lawrence Davis, Christine Berner, our economist, is in the room. And also, Haley Kadish is the head of our Performance and Innovation Office. We put her in charge early on of doing things like tracking employee time and figuring out where CARES dollars goes. And we were really glad to have that additional sort of data analysis capability. And so we're really grateful to have that added horsepower in budget this year. So as the Mayor mentioned, we're proposing that in addition to our $49.4 million reserve, which is sort of our mandated reserve that we have every year, we're also carrying forward about $40 million as a contingency for that long, uncertain road ahead. It will protect us against potential revenue drops into the next fiscal year 22. So as you know, we're going to be right into that budgeting cycle in just a few months. So I'm going to talk about some budget highlights in terms of these buckets that we usually talk about, like economic development and supporting vulnerable populations. But if the COVID pandemic has taught us anything, it is that all of these things are deeply interrelated. We know that if there's another surge in COVID cases, there will be another shutdown, and that will hurt the economy. And we know that it doesn't matter what part of the community it hits. If our ICUs are full, if our ventilators are occupied, then it's going to hit every part of our city. So if there was ever any doubt, the pandemic has shown us that everything is public health, and that healthy communities really are everything, including the economic backbone of our city. We all need to get through this crisis and become the healthy, vibrant place we know that we can be together. So starting with economic recovery programs, we're investing over $20 million directly into Albuquerque to help business owners and families, in addition to the millions that we invested last fiscal year. And some highlights of that include $1 million in direct small business support. As many of you know, we did some direct microgrants last year as well to artists, to restaurants, to retail, and to other micro businesses, about $1.8 million of that last fiscal year, another $1 million this year. $1.125 million in masks and guards and all the other protective equipment that businesses need, and that was led by council as well. $1 million in outdoor business improvements. So we know that patios are now essential for both retail and restaurants, and so between fee waivers and additional grants to help with things like tents and then eventually with things like heaters, we're putting another $1 million into helping our local businesses with that. And then $250,000 in e-commerce grants, because a lot of our folks, especially our very small and solopreneurs, they've had to go online with their businesses for the first time, and we want to help support that as well. We've also been working with the state, and we're really grateful that the state has done also a great job in deploying their Local Economic Development Act, their LEDA funds, and we work with them to administer those funds locally. So we've done $225,000 in LEDA grants and $344,000 in zero interest loans to local companies, and we've got another $1 million of that in the pipeline that you'll be hearing about over the next few months. We also have $5.3 million in promotional funds for tourism and economic development, and that comes through our lodgers tax and hospitality fees funds. And it's no secret that our lodgers and our tourism industry has been hit so hard by the pandemic here and everywhere, and we want to make sure to continue to support those sectors of the economy. We also have $2.5 million in direct assistance to families who are excluded by federal stimulus and unemployment programs, and a $1 million youth employment program to put our residents to work on parks projects, maybe an old CCC style project, but we think it's going to be great for a lot of our youth who are stuck in that place. Maybe they were going to go to college, maybe they were even going to go to CNM. Now they don't know what they're going to do. We want to give some employment opportunities for those folks as well. And then $250,000 for expanding our Financial Navigators program, which connects our residents and especially our businesses to all this web of financial resources that's kind of difficult to understand. So I think we might be next slide here. Next I'm going to talk about the investments we're making in keeping our city healthy and safe. Again, another investment of over $20 million. But what this is really about is taking some of the lessons we've learned from the pandemic and taking more long-term investments to fill those cracks in the system that COVID has made so evident. So to protect our most vulnerable communities, we're investing over $54 million, including $2.5 million to prevent homelessness through housing vouchers, through rental assistance, and through eviction prevention. We know this is a huge issue, and we know also that when we do things like rental assistance, we're actually putting money in the pockets of landlords in addition to helping people from getting evicted. So as opposed to the freeze on evictions, which can leave some folks out in the cold because they're not collecting that necessary rent, some of these programs actually put money in the hands of landlords, and that's really important as well. $2.8 million to expand community-wide COVID testing for vulnerable populations in conjunction with community partners. We've had an amazing partnership with the State Department of Health, UNMH, Healthcare for the Homeless, so many of our partners, the Medical Reserve Corps. And what this has resulted in is, other cities have had extremely high rates of COVID in their homeless population. And it's hard to track, but Iowa has reported 69%. Pennsylvania 54%, Massachusetts 41% of their homeless community testing COVID positive. We don't have really clear state data, but we know that in our West Side Emergency Housing Center, we've only had 7 positive COVID cases, and that's because of the safety net system that we set up. In addition, $2.3 million to address the digital divide. So you've heard about our Wi-Fi on Wheels program. We're going to double down on that to put Wi-Fi in city housing. We're working with the Housing Authority and the county, hopefully going to do that citywide, so that we're giving all of our kids a chance to succeed in school, which is now online. And just under $1 million to expand senior programming, including meals, for that population that is more isolated than even the rest of the population. So moving on to public safety, we know that this is always a top issue in the minds of our city and in the minds of our city staff and our police department, and we're not going to let the pandemic knock us off that course. Of course, it is always going to be a top priority, but Mayor Keller, from the moment, even when he was running for office, said we have to fight crime from all sides. This is not just about police, it is about prevention, and so you'll see those priorities reflected in our budget. Now, we've been very clear that our police department has been underfunded and understaffed, and the mayor made a commitment early on to hiring up to those historical level of officers just to meet the existing need. We have over 1 million 911 calls a year just on the police side, for example. So our budget does include $2.5 million to as the net cost of hiring 100 more officers after you account for other sources of funding and as well as retirements and separations. $5.2 million for reform related to the DOJ, $627,000 for electronic control weapons that have, those are, tasers, that have that audit trail. So again, that's a compliance issue. We know whether people are using force properly. $600,000 for body cameras, which we've continued to lead the state on, but is now mandated by the state as well, and $500,000 for our violence intervention program that we just talked about a couple weeks ago. We also believe in fighting the public safety challenges from the perspective of safe and clean and healthy neighborhoods and communities. So, clean and safe public spaces and a thriving built environment is a key component of bringing down all types of crime. So we're going to be fully funding our ADAPT program, which is our criminal nuisance program, as well as the Code Enforcement Division, fully funding Clean Cities and Block by Block to the tune of $11.3 million, $300,000 in emergency board-up contracts, $300,000 in park safety investments, which has been a huge issue for our city, and full funding for the Animal Welfare Department, again, just to keep our streets safe. On the safe community side, we're going to continue to tackle issues like substance abuse, homelessness, domestic violence, and youth opportunities. I'm not going to read all these numbers, but what we've done is we've chosen not to compromise on these key areas of public safety. We are funding these at the level that we funded them in the past because we know they continue to be just so important to our city. And then finally, in our other two public safety departments, Albuquerque Community Safety Department, we again know that policing is not enough. We joined our community in calling for the need to revisit those situations where police are, and we're taking the first step in establishing that department with a proposed budget of $7.5 million. We'll also be leveraging existing contracts with behavioral health and substance abuse providers to really get the most out of that department. And then, of course, our fire and rescue department continues to lead the nation, both in the COVID response. Our teams are out there doing decontamination on wildland scenes. They are stepping up for our community in all kinds of different ways, and we have the full budget for both them and the Office of Emergency Management at $63.6 million. And finally, since day one, the mayor has been committed to helping youth get off the streets, out of harm's way, and engaged in communities. And that is just even more important now because it's really supporting our workforce, who so many parents we hear from every day just don't know what they're going to do with their kids all day, or they have a system, but if anything changes, if one person gets sick, if a grandparent can't do it that day, then the whole system starts to fall apart. And so we are fully funding our Head Start programs that serve 800 children on any given day, and $4 million to make our youth programs in our community centers and our multi-generational centers continue to work year-round. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to our Chief Financial Officer, Sanjay Bhatta.
Thank you, Sarita. So I will start with our response to the investment as far as the public safety and some proactive expenditure related to keep our city healthy and safe. The highlight of that is first responders, emergency operations center, tracking the spread of COVID and availability of hospital beds, public health awareness and outreach. We spent approximately $54 million in these categories. This also includes a FEMA match of approximately $1.5 million. As far as the FY21 general fund summary table, which is the next slide, the total resources in FY21 are $590 million, and we have $102 million in carry forward from FY20. That amount is slightly higher because we spent some COVID money last year, and that helped us with carry forward balance. So our overall available resources at the beginning of 2021 as budgeted is $692 million. Our expenditure budget for FY21 just for general fund is $592 million. To give you a context, the similar number last year was $641 million. So this year it is significantly lower. That said, last year we had also approximately $21 million in general fund, which was one-time money thanks to the accounting change. So that number are slightly higher because of that $21 million. But even if you remove that $21 million, our general fund budget is lower than last year. To that, we have to reappropriate some encumbrances which are valid. And that has to be budgeted again this year. Then we have a required reserve of $49 million, which is 1/12 of our expenditure budget. On top of that, we would have approximately $40 million, which is a contingency. Now, this money could have been used for other white papers. However, we just don't know how fiscal year 22 will look like, and it would be a prudent thing to have a little bit of contingency moving into FY22. So this is a responsible thing to do, and we will be beginning fiscal year 2022 with $89 million and see how the revenues come along in fiscal year 2022. This year, we are expecting approximately $19 million reduction in gross receipt tax compared to actual numbers of fiscal year 2020. So as you remember, we had a decline of approximately $27 million in fiscal year 20. On top of that, we will have a decline of $19 million just in gross receipt tax. The other decline in general fund was about $8 million. And that is charges for service, the fees at zoo, permit fees, things like that. We saw a reduction of $8 million in FY 2020, and we believe that that will continue. So it would remain flat in FY 21. The largest revenue decline outside general fund is in the aviation department. It is expected to decline about 35%. That translates into $20 million, roughly speaking. So Mayor had mentioned earlier that the overall decline in 2021 is expected to be about $50 million, which includes aviation, gross receipt tax, and other revenues of the city. There are some highlights as to what are the expenses which went up. Overall, we have kept the budget flat. However, there are some expenditures which we have no control over, such as health insurance premium, which is going to be about $3.4 million. Now, we went to self-insured mode last year, so that's why this number is slightly less than what it would have been. So we are actually doing much better compared to some other cities, and that increases approximately 6.5%. The largest tax and hospitality fees doesn't get any subsidy from the general fund, but this is a very extraordinary year. And as Sarita mentioned, that's one of the hardest hit sector. And 50% of the largest tax revenue goes towards marketing, and other 50% goes towards debt service, and we believe there would be a shortfall in the revenue. So we have to put aside $3.5 million to make sure that we make our debt service payment. It helps with our bond rating. Isotope Stadium subsidy, this is something new this year. They are closed. However, there are some expenses which are, we have to continue with that. And that's approximately $1.3 million. That's a new item this year. Gas tax operating fund subsidy, we see that the gas tax revenue is declining. It could be based on consumption. Also the oil price has gone down. So we have some salaries from that fund, and it would need to be subsidized by $625,000 so that we don't have to do any furloughs or layoffs in that fund. This next table is different than prior years. The reason we wanted to do this is that on the left-hand side you have the rollover budget. As you recall, because of the pandemic, we just submitted FY20 budget as a rollover budget towards the end of March, and that was approved by Council in April. And in that budget, we just added some high-level items that we knew at that time would be necessary. And now we are revisiting those items. Some of them may go away, some of them may be revised, and then there may be some new items. So these two columns will give you an idea what we had in our mind in March versus what we are doing as far as the finalizing the budget. So some of the items The reduction of $21 million, that was very obvious. In FY20, we had one-time money attributed to accounting change. That will go away. Then there is no COLA, cost of living adjustment, and that continues with the final budget as well. The increase, the salary savings, we are moving from 0% to 3%. It's basically compelling the APD to tighten up their budget and manage the budget in a more smart way. It's not really taking the money away, but they have the salary savings, so they will have to figure out how best to use that money. There is an increase in medical cost, which is 6.5%. That remains same. From March till now, I mean, there is no change into that. In March, we thought that there would be an increase in dental insurance of 4%. Fortunately, that is going away. There is no increase in that. The gross receipt tax administrative fees, this is a new item. However, it is not an additional expenses. It's just a better way to account for it. In prior years, the Tax and Revenue Department used to send us the net amount only. Now they are breaking down into what is the gross distribution and what are their fees. So we are paying them fees of about $5.4 million, and that would be accounting issue which we are fixing now. Then there is a $500,000 reduction in the early retirement fund. We have reviewed last 3 years activity in that fund, and we believe we can manage with $6 million. All the media reorganizations and administrative reorganization which occurred in 2022, that had been taken care of in the new budget. There were no issue papers included in March, and now we have some issue papers included in the revised budget, which are inevitable and we have to approve them. Then if you look at the next column, which is the amendment to the budget we submitted in March. So this year the legislation you will see, which we sent this morning to the council, is slightly different than the prior years. This legislation will only show what are the differences between what we submitted in March versus what is the final budget. So you will have to compare the budget we submitted in March versus what we are doing now. No COLA, cost of living, that stays. As Mayor mentioned, that was a prudent thing to do, and we just don't have money to give any systemic raises. That said, we want to make sure that employees receive at least the same money they have been receiving last year. So the premium for the health insurance increase would approximately be $239 for full family coverage. And we are going to give $375 as a one-time payment to all the employees, and with their taxes and all that, it would translate into about $250, which should take care of that increase in the health insurance. As I mentioned before, there is no dental increase. Fuel adjustment, we are actually saving money. We had a fixed price contract, which after the oil price crash, we had to revisit, and we took the decision to cancel that contract, and now we are buying at the market price. So that would save us some money, and we have bought a hedge. So at certain point, if the price goes up, then that hedge will be active. So we believe that just in general fund, there would be savings of approximately $900,000 across the city, in transit and in solid waste. There would be savings of maybe another $1 million+ plus. So we are just taking advantage of the lower fuel price. Lodger and hospitality debt service subsidy, I talked about that. $3.5 million will help us to make the payment by end of fiscal year 21. However, if that sector comes up and if the revenues are higher than expected, we may not need that 3.5, but that's what we are budgeting right now. We also have CARES payroll and transit reduction. So certain first responders, the medical responders, our Office of Emergency Management, we are using the CARES money for that payroll, and we will continue to use that until end of December. Transit would have a little less subsidy from the general fund than prior years because they have approximately $27+ million grant, and they would be able to use that money. And that money is more flexible. It doesn't have any expiration date, so we are reducing the subsidy by $5 million, which helps the general fund. Risk recovery, a few years ago there was an actuarial study done, and it required us to approximately contribute more than $3 million in addition to the risk history of last year. We are just going to reduce that additional contribution by 50% this year, considering the difficult budgetary situation we have. Then we are creating the new Albuquerque Community Safety Department. That's $7.5 million. However, majority of that amount is already existing in other departments, and we are just moving it to the new department. We have about $1.3 million in stadium operating subsidy. As I mentioned before, we have some expenses which are inevitable, not avoidable, so we will have to subsidize. Same thing with the gas tax. We have some issue papers. As Mayor mentioned before, almost $30+ million worth of issue papers were not approved, but then there were some which we had to. It's inevitable. Those are unavoidable expenditures. Some of the CIP coming online would require some money, so that is there. And then the Golf Enterprise Fund traditionally was not in general fund. We are bringing that into general fund. The reason for that is it's consistently not sustainable fund, and this way we will be able to tap into the Go Bond funding for some major renovations which may be needed in the golf fund. With that, I'm going to hand over to Mayor for some final thoughts. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for that, Sanjay. And I think actually we're probably going to move to questions here, but let me just mention a little bit about next steps. First of all, we'll be posting and sharing a memo that summarizes basically everything that you've heard. And so for questions on those numbers, or if you didn't get anything, those will be up there, as well as a summary, an overall summary of how we're using the total $150 million of CARES money. That's now all accounted for in a very simple table, which will be available. Now, next steps for this. This now goes down to council, so they are meeting, I believe, on Wednesday because of the holiday. And so there are a number of transmissals. We talked about the transit bond issue yesterday. And so this now goes down to council. They will do their hard work on this over the course of September. And there's a number of public meetings and so forth that will be the same as they normally would be in the month of June. They're just happening now in September. And then in October, we'll hope to finalize this and have it wrapped up by the end of October, back up here for signature in the mayor's office. So I think with that, we will go ahead and take questions.
You said you were.
And let me just check, Jessica. Do you want other Jessica for? Are we doing online? Or what's your game plan? Okay.
You talked about postponing new initiatives and that being about $30 million in savings. What were those initiatives?
It's a good question. There were lots of them. So each department submits white paper requests for different ideas, and they range. Sarita could probably give a few examples, so I'll let her give a few examples. But there's usually 4 or 5 from every department. So are there any you just want to mention as examples?
Sure. So there were some sort of innovative ideas that we weren't able to do this year around some additional peer support, I think, in some of our public safety departments. There was a request for police vehicles that I think we had to cut all the way back down to a much smaller number. There were some requests around park irrigation initiatives that we cut, and then some of the ones that made it in are at a smaller scale than we originally had planned, just as a few examples. For example, in animal welfare, we've had a highly successful mobile van spay and neuter program, and we wanted to really, originally when we thought this was going to be a normal year, we wanted to expand that and maybe even double the number of people we'd be able to reach, and we weren't able to do that type of expansion. Just some examples.
So what of the stuff that was in the budget that you cut is just stuff that you never got to?
Exactly.
Well, it was stuff that was supposed
To be, but then didn't. Yeah, because so we went through this, right, we went through our whole budget process like normal in March, and we had approved a, whole list of things, and then we had to go back, and that's why there are cuts in, yeah.
Jessica?
On the raises, were these, can you explain, were they contractual raises that have been frozen? Have you talked to the unions? How does that work? Can you go a little bit further into that? Because I know a lot of contracts have raises built in.
Sure. Questions about raises and so forth. And, as a reminder, all our unionized employees were under a collective bargaining agreement. And we were able to do, for the first time in a long time, a 2-year agreement when we came in with all our unions. And then the state passed something called PBA, is the acronym. And it basically means that those contracts, again, this is state law, those contracts are evergreen until they're renegotiated. So right now, those are still in place. And those particular contracts, though, did not have escalators beyond what was originally stated.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So we are still technically under collective bargaining agreement with all our units. Normally, we go back to the table in December, January, February. We try to sort of take them in phases, but we suspended all negotiations when COVID hit because we knew exactly what was going to happen in terms of revenue uncertainty. And the unions at that time were really supportive, understanding also that we weren't going to make promises that we couldn't keep. So we do not have any scheduled increases under existing agreements. We are still in pause on negotiations. So we will probably need to make some small agreements about this one-time payment for health insurance. But, if we get to later in the year or we get to the new budget for FY22 and it looks like there'll be more recurring revenue, then we would, of course, want to sit down and talk about raises. The difference is we have some money to do some of these great initiatives because we have one-time money, we have CARES money. What we don't have is an infusion of recurring dollars, and that's what you need to substantiate those types of raises, and of course, our employees understand that very well.
No, we can go, okay. So the big thing, the 7.5 million that's going over into the community safety department, and I know Sanjay just mentioned that there are pieces that are coming from other departments to help fund that, so that's not new money. Can you go a little bit further into what does that look like in terms of what's that funding? Counselors, police officers? Can you guys go a little bit further into that?
Sure. Questions about the new community safety department. And a couple of things. We are doing a series of community outreach forums. They're all online, but there's actually, I think, almost a dozen that are happening right now. I was on a few earlier today. So we are on track in terms of mapping out what that department's going to do and how it's going to work. What we did need to do in the budget is, of course, understand the sort of funding bucket that we could play with. And so for us, I think there's funding from at least 5 different departments, and it spans a range of behavioral health, of homeless services, of community outreach, of community service, or community public safety service coordination, and as well as some basic things like what we do with abandoned cars, what we do with parking enforcement, what we do with transit public safety as well.
And do you know those 5 departments that the money was drawn from, or is that listed in the bill?
It'll be in the budget. Off the top of my head, I mean, there's some from APD, there's some from DMD, there's some from Family and Community Services. I think those are the big ones. All right.
I've got one more
Let's
question.
just any online. I know we had some, but they dropped off. So
Okay.
they tend to be less patient. It's okay. While we're waiting, go ahead,
You can
TJ.
see me, I am smiling. President, obviously this budget relies on a lot of federal money. And there's been a lot of news going on this past week involving President Trump making threats to cities run by Democrat mayors in terms of cutting funding, whether it's on Twitter or memos, what have you. Are you worried about that at all, given the position we're in?
Well, I mean, this is a nonpartisan mayor's office, so, I'm just
Yeah,
kidding.
sure.
I know. For us, here's the thing. Number one, I think what he's describing just doesn't apply to Albuquerque. I mean, it's not even close. Like, the kind of description he's giving is clearly about cities that are on TV every night, which is not ours. And so his comments just don't describe our city. Number two, we've seen this before. The same thing happened with immigration, with child separation, the same threats for funding, and frankly, we won a lot in court along with other cities to basically push back on that. So we continue to do that if we need to. And the third thing is, we've got what we need in here. And so, of course, we always would love federal money, and we're using $150 million right now. But we've got a budget that works for our city, and we're going to be okay regardless.
All right, and we do have a question from Chris McKee at KRQE. He says, is there an estimate on how many fewer jobs the city is outlining for this budget based on the hiring freeze as compared to pre-COVID levels?
Question is about the number of jobs that are available at the city, sort of before and now with our broad hiring freeze. There are, of course, exceptions to that. And so if you have the exact numbers, I'll go ahead.
So we have about 583 positions frozen, which constitutes just about 9% of the city's workforce. And of course, we're making exceptions on a case-by-case basis. For example, police cadets, firefighter cadets are still being approved, but that 583 number is net across the whole city. Thanks.
But could that grow? You guys are anticipating that to grow, right? I guess that's what the question is.
Yeah, so basically, also just for the question, the denominator on that's roughly 6,000. So we do expect that to grow because as more people leave, right, there's going to be more vacancies that we're saying we're not going to fill. So we have a little bit of that built in. But I do want to remind folks, we are making broad exception for public safety and just urgent positions that we need. And so those two things kind of might cancel each other out. It just depends on how many retirements and departures we have.
Did you guys break the hiring freeze at some point in the last 6 months to hire some positions outside of public safety? And if so, how many was that?
The question is, did we, was there a break in the hiring freeze over the last 6 months and so forth? The answer is, again, remember, we are allowing ourselves, giving ourselves the flexibility to make exceptions. And when the economy was picking up, we did really need some things like bus drivers and so forth. So we did add in, it was bus drivers, I think solid waste was the other one, where we felt actually there was both a need and revenue was looking a little better. So we did sort of take a whole chunk that had been on hold. But those had been on hold, I think, since April. So they were already essentially through the HR process. We just said, okay, you can actually start work.
Do you know how many that was? What was in that?
I don't have that number, but we can.
We can get back to you on it. Yeah.
I've got one thing. Obviously, a lot of people are buying online right now. We talked a little bit about this a couple days ago. That obviously hurts city coffers. A lot of people don't realize that. Would you encourage people to shop Amazon right now, or?
We always want everyone to buy local as much as they can. And it's just because it has that multiplier effect. So fortunately, thanks to some advocacy with our CFO, we now we're starting to get slices of online tax. So we are very fortunate as a state and as a city that the legislature permitted that and refined that in the special session. That was absolutely critical to our finances. But that's just a one-time payment. When you buy local, we get the tax money, we get the associated spending, we get the jobs. So the multiplier is much, much higher local. We are always better off if you shop local.
You talked about, I guess Sanjay talked about the aviation shortfall. Has there been, what's the impact been there? I mean, $30 million seems pretty significant. Have they had to cut a lot of staff? Or, I mean, I guess you haven't done layoffs, but.
Yeah, so the question is about aviation. And between Sanjay and Lawrence, whoever wants to field that certainly can. Want to mention, our hardest hit sector by far is hospitality and tourism. That directly impacts the airport. And so these are two enterprise funds, the airport and solid waste. And so just as a heads up, we're going to continue to sort of modify and adjust what's happening with both those departments in the month of September. because they're both in very different situations. One is getting used more than it ever has before. That would be solid waste. The other one is being used less than it's ever been used before, and that's aviation. So which one of you wants to? I'm going to give Lawrence a turn. All right. You can use it if you want.
No, it's okay. A couple of things, as the mayor mentioned, the aviation fund is an enterprise fund. And as a result, if you can think of the aviation department as sort of as a mini city, it has many customers and contracts with different entities that use the facility for purposes of providing services. One important item for the airport is that the airport did receive a direct CARES funding for airport when all the airports were having issues across the country. The Congress authorized dollars to specifically for airport use. So they received about $19 million of CARES funds, and so as a result, during the when we went to the council for a budget adjustment, we were able to use some of those CARES dollars to pick up, if you will, the revenue shortfalls that were occurred as a result of basically having our employments go from about 7,800 passengers a day down to, at one point, about 105, 106 passengers. So a lot of the retail shops, the concession shops, if you will, for food and beverage, a lot of the car rental facilities, et cetera, that experienced a slowdown, we were able to use those CARE dollars or those federal dollars to offset their budget. Again, as Sanjay and Sarita both mentioned, our structure was that we would use a portion of that for this year. We went to the council and got their approval. We have additional revenues available to use going forward into FY21. And unlike the $150 million that we have of CARES dollars for the city as a whole, the airport funds don't have a sunset to spend, have them spent by the end of this December. Those funds are available to carry over for another 2 fiscal years, so we've managed that. So that helps keep the airport operating in good place, and it helps keep our employees continuing to provide the services, and hopefully helps bridge the gap, hopefully, as we move out of COVID at some point to get us back to our normal operation.
All right, any others? Okay, all right, well, thank you, everybody. We will talk to you soon. Thank you.